So let's talk about incident response. Incident response deals with when there's some sort of an incident that involves IT security or any of the laws and regulations we just described, or any violation of policy, or if there's any kind of infiltration on our network. Then we have to have some sort of incident response. And the important thing about incident response is we have to have a plan. And step by step exactly what we're going to do. And why is this so important? Why am I shoving this into our unit about the laws and regulations? Those laws and regulations really have to guide how we're going to do incident response. We have to make sure that we're cognizant of the laws and the regulations and how we respond to the incidents, and that we follow procedures that will allow us to investigate and respond to incidents in a way that's legal and a way that it can allow us to press charges if we have to, if it's a civil case, understand whether or not we're going to go to the authorities depending on how the incident plays out and so forth. So in any incident response procedure, the first thing you do is have some framework for declaring an incident. So what rises to the level of being an incident that's worth responding to? So usually you have some kind of a trigger for an incident. It could be malfunctions or an outage. People aren't able to access resources on the network for some reason, so we have to investigate that. Could be an alert to some kind of threat or vulnerability. Now, that could be an alert internally from some kind of intrusion detection system, which we're going to talk about those in Unit 8 and 9. We'll talk more about what an IDS is and how they work. But this could also be alerts that are coming externally. So maybe it's a warning from the government saying that there's some virus that we know about, or on Thursday at 4 o'clock, there's going to be an attack because there's some virus that's going to unleash some malware or something like that. It may come through the news media. Customers can notify you. Maybe customers are telling you something happened to them. So, for example, one time I got a brand new credit card, and I kept it in my wallet for 3 months and never used it. And one day I decided to use it at a Walmart. And the next day, after I used it at the Walmart, I got a phone call from the credit card company saying my credit card number was stolen. And I knew it had to be Walmart. It's the only place I used my card. And I went into Walmart and I showed them a copy of my statement. And I said, clearly there's nothing here except for Walmart. And after I charged Walmart, that's when all the fraudulent charges started. And that kicked off an incident for Walmart to say, hey, maybe somebody's got a card skimmer. In fact, it turned out the person that checked me out used the card skimmer. Um, Internal staff might notify you that there's some kind of an incident happening or has happened, and it's probably the most common way we're notified of incidents in most organizations. So somehow we declare that something has happened that needs to be investigated. So once that happens, we start with triage. We identify and analyze information. We search for a root cause of the incident. We get experts involved if we need to. We try to find out what happened, how exactly it happened, what is the scope of the damage, and how can it be contained. One of the important things here is the root cause analysis. A lot of folks fall short of root cause analysis, where they don't know what happens is something happens, and instead of identifying the root cause of what happened, they just fix the issue on the surface. So somebody calls in and says, I'm not able to access my account. They just go ahead and reset their password and say, go ahead and access your account. Problem solved, case closed, right? But if we did a root cause analysis, we might discover that the reason they couldn't log in is because somebody changed their password 3 hours ago from an IP address in the Ukraine. And that probably should kick off an incident, but it doesn't because we didn't do a root cause analysis. So it's important to do root cause analysis. You always want to know what is the root cause of this issue. So you're not just fixing things on the surface, you're getting to the root cause. So again, we want to know what happened, how it happened, what the scope of the damage is, and how we can contain it. So that's all going to happen in the analysis. So we're going to do some triage, do some investigation, and then do some in-depth analysis and hopefully find a root cause and in retrospect look at what happened, how it happened, and what the scope of the damage is. Then we're going to be concerned with containment. So once we understand everything, now we have to make sure we can stop whatever it is that's happening, prevent any further damage to our infrastructure, and what controls could we put in place to prevent this from happening again? So again, our main goal here in containment is put out the fire that's burning now, but then also look at how we can prevent that fire from starting again in the future. So look for whatever it is that you can do that's going to prevent this from happening again. That's an important part of the containment phase. Then we're going to do some recovery. So we're going to try to restore to our condition from prior to the incident. So we understand what happened at this point. We contained it, and we tried to put in place or understand what we can do to keep this from happening again. And now we want to get ourselves back to the condition that we were at previous to this particular incident. So that's an important part of the incident response, is to get it back to where we were before. And when all that's done, our final step is debriefing, which is where we reflect on what had happened. We look at the response. So at this point, we've already passed the recovery point. So now we have everything back to the way it was. Everything's back to normal. But what could we have done better? What can we change? Was there any mistakes made? What was done right? So we do some kind of debriefing to figure out, where we stand and what we did right and what we did wrong. So one of the things that's changed in recent history in IT security is the old way of thinking about breaches was no news is good news. In other words, if you're not aware of a breach on your network, then we just assume that there is no breach, right? So if there's no sign of anything bad happening, then we can sit back and relax because there's nothing happening. We wait until something happens to make the assumption that there's some kind of a breach in our network or in our digital infrastructure. However, the new way of thinking, the new mindset is we always assume that breaches may have occurred, whether they're discovered or not. So we're constantly looking for evidence as to whether or not there's a breach. We don't wait for some evidence to bubble up to the surface. We're auditing logs. We're looking at firewalls. We're looking at what's happening on the network. And that's what our intrusion detection systems are doing, which we're going to talk about later on. So this has been a pretty significant shift. So most organizations are kind of blending investment in breach prevention and response, because if we can prevent things from happening in the first place, then it's less likely that we have to respond to them. So things like ethical hacking and vulnerability testing and things like that are tools that we have to try to look for ways that people are going to breach our network before it happens, and make the assumption that if the vulnerability is there, someone has already taken advantage of that vulnerability if it exists. So we're always looking for and trying to find those vulnerabilities. So as far as incident management goes, so creation of a vulnerability and threat awareness capability, there are frameworks like everything else. So there are frameworks that help us manage how we respond to incidents and manage incidents. And one of those is CERT. So an incident response model is CERT, from 1988, which was an awful long time ago. There's also the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, or FIRST.org, which has some tips. And my personal favorite, NIST publications, the 800-61 publications, certainly has some frameworks that you can adopt. So the things that I've talked about already, when I talked about incident response models, or when I talked rather about incident response and those basic steps, those are defined for you in these various models that you can use as a framework to develop your incident response policies. And again, incident response is closely related to regulation and law, because you have to make sure that you do this in a way that not only complies with the law, but can allow you to use the law in your favor when you need to. For example, if you're doing incident response and you find some evidence of a crime, if you don't handle that evidence properly, and maybe it's a civil case, if you don't handle the evidence properly, say for a civil case, it may not be admissible in court. Your case, the entire case may fall apart because you screwed up and didn't do something right. So it's important to be aware of the law and how all this relates. So some of the types of investigations that you're going to do as far as the law goes and regulation, it might be employee misconduct. You may have malware that has infiltrated the network that you're going to do some kind of an investigation. You could have stolen assets, physical capital that's been stolen, that you have to investigate. And violation of acceptable use policy is probably one of the most common things we investigate in IT security. So usually you're notified from HR or from from managers, and they will notify you of some violation of the AUP. You can learn about acceptable use policies and these frameworks for incident response in other courses. One of them is there is an entire course on incident response, and there is also an entire course on forensic investigations, which we'll talk more about here in just a few minutes. And there's also an entire course on IT security policy, which talks about acceptable use policies in much greater detail, how you would put those together and how they would support your IT security. At some point, you may have to make a decision as to whether or not you would involve law enforcement. And a lot of companies are reluctant to involve law enforcement. You would think that, of course I want to involve law enforcement because I want the guilty party to get punished. I want restitution for this crime, or you want to file a civil case and so forth and so on. So a lot of times you want to get law enforcement. Your first instinct is to call the police and get them involved. But there are definitely some cons to getting the authorities involved. One is negative publicity. As soon as you notify the authorities, it's on public record that the incident happened, and now you have to manage that aspect of it. I would never recommend hiding things from the public because things always are going to come out. So, for example, if you had a major data breach and somebody stole 5,000 customer records, including credit card numbers, you wouldn't want to not call the authorities just because you don't want to have to tell your 5,000 customers their data has been stolen. That would be unethical, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But maybe if somebody stole the plans for your latest widget from your servers, maybe somebody got in and took the blueprints for the company's new product. The only harmed party there is the company, and that's where maybe you might sit down and think, well, do we want to notify the authorities because now it's going to become common knowledge that our IP was stolen, or do we just deal with this? Do we come up with a new design, or how are we going to handle this to mitigate the loss? The other con that I don't have on the presentation here is if you involve law enforcement in any kind of crime dealing with digital infrastructure, law enforcement will typically want to take some of that data. They might want to take an image of drives. They might want to actually physically take the equipment if the company's directly involved in the crime. So in many cases, you may not want to lose use of that equipment. So that's another thing to think about. And again, if anything affects the customers, there's also an ethical concern here too. So you also have to make this decision from an ethical viewpoint as well as from a business viewpoint. But certainly you don't want to just pick up the phone right away and call the police every time something happens. You have to assess whether or not it's appropriate to call the police. One group that could help you with that is corporate attorneys. So in many cases, in most organizations, before you call the law enforcement, you would call the corporate attorney and give them the scenario, and they would notify you whether or not it's appropriate to involve law enforcement. I will tell you that anytime there is any immediate threat to life and property, you always want to call the law enforcement immediately. You wouldn't wait to call the lawyer. So again, that's a judgment call, but any immediate threat that you've identified to life and property, certainly you would notify the authorities immediately. So some forensic techniques and procedures. These are, again, more NIST documents that help us out here, but forensics is the specifics on how we investigate any crimes that or violations that have been committed. And when I say violations, I mean our acceptable use policies, and procedures that are internal, as well as investigating anything that might be a crime. And usually what happens in IT organizations, we begin by investigating an infraction of our acceptable use policy and policies and procedures, which could eventually lead to a criminal investigation. So, for example, you've discovered that somebody's using their work computer to do things that are not appropriate, and in that investigation, maybe somebody suspects somebody of using their work computer to watch pornography at work. Gosh, who would do that? But whatever. And then, obviously it's not a crime to watch pornography in most jurisdictions. But then in the course of the investigation, you discover they're not just watching pornography, it's child pornography. Well, now it's crossed the line into being a crime. So certainly both are discussed in forensics. And if you take the computer forensics course, both topics are discussed, how we do civil and criminal forensic investigations. But again, we've got some guidelines that are already created for us in the NIST documents that you can certainly take a look at. So one of the first steps is to identify and gather evidence, regardless of any of these frameworks you use. We always start by identifying and gathering evidence. So some places we could start is looking at email, looking at where people went on the web, looking at their web history, any data that they've stored, any inappropriate access that's been identified. So we look for any leads and we follow the trail. So we start with, oh, here's something that isn't right. Let's see where this takes us, and you follow the evidence. So you have a starting point, and then you follow the path to which that evidence leads. The next step is to, let me fast forward here, is to preserve the evidence. So you're going to collect the evidence, generally working in isolation. You have to maintain the chain of custody, which I'm going to talk about here in just a second. But you want to preserve the evidence. So one of the things that they'll talk about in a computer forensics class is making sure that when you take an image of a hard drive, for example, that you're not modifying the original copy of the data. So there's special techniques and special ways that we do all these things. There are tools that are available to us to make sure that we are that we're not harming the evidence, that we're not adulterating any of the evidence that we're collecting. So certainly some techniques with that. But chain of evidence get its own category here, because when you're collecting all this stuff, the chain of custody is important, because somebody could claim that somebody modified that evidence at some point. So let's say you have evidence of an employee violating some kind of a policy or procedure, and again, one of the things that we're concerned about that from an external point of view is if an employee is violating a policy or procedure and we enforce that policy and procedure, then the case could never be made that the company was complicit in that behavior. So, for example, if an employee is opening up bank accounts for clients all the time, and we're not enforcing the fact that they're not supposed to open up bank accounts for clients without the client requesting an account, then it could be argued that we're complicit in that behavior. But if anytime we detect or expect or suspect that fraud is happening, we fully investigate it and take corrective action, then if it ever came to light that this was happening on a larger scale, perhaps we would have some evidence to point to say, well, we've been trying to stop this. So it could indemnify the company against some of that legal action. Obviously, I'm discussing Wells Fargo here. But in any event, the chain of custody is where we make sure when we collect evidence that we can track the path of that evidence. We know everyone who had access to it. We know when they accessed it, how they accessed it, what they did with it. So we maintain some sort of records. And again, this will be discussed in much more detail on a computer forensics course, but I wanted to mention it so we all understand how important that is. You can't just kind of do your own thing in a corner. You have to make sure you're documenting. You have to make sure that it rises to the level of being admissible in court, for example. And there's different rules for chains of custody, whether it's civil or criminal. And again, in a computer forensics class, you would learn much more about that. And finally, we would present the findings. So you would have some kind of formal report that explains why we had this investigation. It would show the chain of evidence, or the chain of custody of the evidence, details on what we found, an interpretation of what it means, not just here's some files we found, but here's what they mean, and here's what they indicate to us. It should only contain facts, no speculation. You don't want to say that John Doe stole the money because he was mad at the company. That's really not for us to decide, right? That's for someone else to look at. But so we just want to kind of stick to the facts, explain what happened, interpret the evidence. In other words, explain what the evidence means factually, but not try to interpret, not try to speculate on anything. All right, so in the next presentation, I'm going to talk about ethics and codes of conduct.